So the first slide is to point out that science, the application of science in the kitchen per se is not a new idea. It goes way back, and the idea of using it to innovate in the kitchen goes way back. So this is an illustration from a French book from the 18th century, and the translation is right up there. It talks about nouvelle cuisine in 1759. And in order to develop nouvelle cuisine, you need to be a chemist. Back then, what that meant was you need to know your materials. You need to understand what they're composed of. You need to come up with new permutations and combinations, new compounds, in order to meet the changing tastes of the times. The next slide shows even before that point, 7 or 8 decades before that, the kitchen and the eating experience were transformed by a scientific discovery. That is to say, the discovery of the gas laws. The fact that the temperature of a liquid that's boiling depends on the pressure surrounding it. So you can use that information to invent what Papin invented. He called it a digester. We call it a pressure cooker. And in the next slide, you'll see an excerpt from John Evelyn's report. He was a member of the Royal Society. The members of the Royal Society were generally bachelors, and it seems as though they were looking always for excuses to go out and eat at someone else's expense. And Papin would demonstrate his digesters. He would put foods in them, different foods in them, and then the fellows of the Royal Society would get together and have a party. And if you just read through this, you'll see that for them, this was a completely new experience. Bones that were made to have the consistency of cheese, fish that are bony that don't seem to have bones in them once they're done, the very best jelly he's ever tasted. So this is science applied to cooking hundreds of years ago, and it made a tremendous difference. Next slide. This man, Count Rumford baking powder, he's the guy who endowed the professorship. He's not as well known in this country as he should be because he picked the wrong side in the Revolutionary War. So he endowed professorships, but he never came back after the war. He did most of his work in Europe. He invented essentially our modern oven, a metal box that we heat in order to get a temperature. He's also the guy who did the first experiments on what's since become kind of modern 20th, 21st century orthodoxy for cooking meat. Very low temperatures give you the best results. He figured that out hundreds of years ago by cooking legs of mutton in his potato dryer and discovering by accident that cooking in a potato dryer, which only operates at, well, way less than boiling, gives you much more succulent meat. He's also, as far as I can tell, the first guy who did any kind of controlled food science experiment. He was convinced that this technique was much better than roasting over a fire, but he had to demonstrate it. And so he demonstrated it by throwing a party, putting a leg of mutton roasted over the fire at one end of the room, a leg of mutton roasted in his potato dryer at the other end of the room, and at the end of the party, he weighed what was left of the two roasts. And there was a lot more left of the fire-roasted mutton. Next slide. And this is to demonstrate that you can be a chemist and you can screw up. So this guy, Justus Liebig, very important chemist in the history of the development of chemistry, took an interest, unfortunately, in cooking, and he doesn't seem to have done a lot of experiments, unlike Rumford. And he came out with a theory in the middle of the 19th century that searing meat would seal in its juices by cauterizing the outside, preventing the juices from coming out. And there was clearly a hunger at that time for some kind of rational approach to cooking. So in the next slide, you'll see that a book that came out in multiple editions, and an edition came out after Rumford published his researches, now says that in the subtitle that the principles of Baron Liebig have been applied to cooking meat in this book, and therefore it's up to date and it's scientific. And there's a quotation from another holder, actually, of the Rumford chair. I forget his first name, but Dr. Gregory. It's the one of a scientific basis that has given rise to absurd methods of preparing food. The problem is, next slide, if you do the experiment, and anyone who's ever cooked a steak has done the experiment, you always see with your own eyes that there's no such thing as sealing the juices in a piece of meat. But that's still something that you'll hear said casually on TV shows, said in magazine pieces. I've been trying for decades to get it killed, but I haven't been able to kill it. Next slide. So there was a lot of interest in science applied to the kitchen in the 19th century. What happened in the 20th century? Because by the time I came on the scene, not much had been written about it, and that's why I wrote a book. And I think it has in part to do with a couple of developments. One of them is oddly, the development of home economics, that is to say, the institutionalization of the study, scientific study of cooking, because it took a very particular direction. Ellen Richards was the first woman graduate of MIT. She helped found Woods Hole. She was a remarkable scientist and pioneer in all kinds of ways. And she also helped start the home economics profession in the United States. But you'll see in the next slide that in order to make it a respectable profession for a woman, you had to kind of situate it correctly. And clearly, anything that appealed to pleasure rather than to things like hygiene, safety, economy, and things like that didn't count for as much. And so flavor in the writings of these people who founded the discipline was relegated essentially to the status of a contaminant. You know, if you liked something, it's because there are bacteria that you're used to, and it has nothing to do with the goodness of the food. So the recipes that you find coming out of this movement are things like a mayonnaise where you replace the olive oil with mineral oil, because mineral oil it's not going to spoil on you. Next slide. There was also the food security issue in the United States. Back then it wasn't worries about terrorism, it was worries and global warming and things like that. It was simply worries about adulteration. A lot of foods in the United States were adulterated, and so the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906. That mandated analysis of foods to prove that they were pure, and that meant you had to have analytical chemists who would do that kind of work, and that gave rise to the food science profession. Again, nothing to do with pleasure, nothing to do with the process of making foods. It's more to do with safety and things like that. This, by the way, these are pictures of the poison squad, as they were known. These were the people who would eat things to see whether they made you sick or not.